introduction. You have an opportunity to make points, to ask questions of the speakers, and I would encourage you to make points and engage in a dialogue, perhaps rather than just asking questions, although I said I've got some questions in my mind. Just while you're thinking, we'll take those in batches and probably do a couple of batches and then give the panel a chance to respond. And if we have time, we're going to go until 2:30, so we've got like 27 minutes. If we have time, we'll go for a second round. While you're thinking about the issues that have been put in front of you, in reading the book, what struck me really strongly about this was the range of goodies that there are in this book. Actually, it's a very rich book, and maybe that's quite a surprise, because in a sense it's quite a dry material that the book has to play with. But I think the authors have made tremendous good out of that material. One of the things that's in there is an attempt to look around at the different treaties and certification systems on the Kimberley process, for example, was mentioned, but a whole range of these. And then to derive some principles of how you can get these arrangements to work. So 10 principles, if you look at page 29, 10 principles derived. And then the book concludes with the analysis of the application of those principles to the verification of trade in timber. And that gives the book a very good degree of coherence. And I think all the case studies reflect on one or more, or usually 3 or 4 of those principles at least. So I think the book hangs together really nicely. And also beyond the discussion of the principles at the end, there's a policy agenda. So the book doesn't hold back from actually saying where policy might go. We've heard from 2 of the very rich case studies in the book, very contrasting, but both of them raising, I think, very significant issues in their particular context. And I think, again, the book is very, very strong in pointing out that context is everything, and that the approaches that you take, as you said right at the end, Bruce, the approaches that you take really do need to fit into the context. Some central ideas. I think the book raises the possibility, as David pointed out, that there are different approaches to this. There's no magic bullet in there, and you'll probably find challenges and difficulties whichever of these routes you go down. And I guess there are people in the audience who have got experience of some of these different routes, and it'd be very good if, as well as entering into dialogue, you say something briefly, because I'll keep you to a minute or a minute and a half in your contribution about any experience that's relevant that you might put on the table. So, open for business. We've got now 25 minutes, but that's a good length of time. It's a roving microphone. If you'd like to just stick your hand up, please, when you talk, say who you are. If you want to say where you come from, don't give a CV or anything like that. Just do it very, very briefly. Yeah, John.
Thank you. My name is John Hudson from the Department for International Development, British Government. Thank you to all the speakers. I was thinking what Bruce was saying about the need for tact and patience and diplomacy, and I'm sure that's right. I wonder, practicing that in the context of British Columbia, where there is a greater balance of power between the different actors than we find in many countries that I work in. What guidance you could give us to develop those powers of patience and tact. And a point for Guillermo about one of your slides you had showing the production from natural forest declining, that from agroforestry and plantations going up. Now that you've got this new policy instrument in place, do you think the owners of natural forest are in a position to have the incentive to increase their production in those forests? Thank you.
Okay, let's collect a few issues and questions, and then give you a chance to respond. Would anybody else like to ask anything? Make a contribution? Yeah.
Thank you. It's very interesting. My name is Susanna Walmsley. I work from MRAG, I'm actually from the fisheries sector, so the forest issues are new to me, but there's a lot of parallels between fisheries and forestry and legal and illegal timber and fish. I was interested in particular in the EU VPAs, which are voluntary partnership agreements, is that right? And the way that they're implemented. In fisheries, the EU has recently brought in a new regulation for trade of illegal trade, or to combat trade in illegal fisheries products. But they're applying a sort of blanket system to all countries, so all imports of fish from third countries will have to be certified by the fishing nation as being legal. I just wondered if you had any comments on the potential for that system to really work, and the sort of parallels with the VPAs and the length of time it's taken to implement them on a much more national basis rather than this sort of blanket single system for all countries. And also if there's any support for the VPAs for the implementing countries from the EU to help them develop and improve their management system.
Hi, my name's Amanda Jacobs, and I was with Computer Aid International and soon joining panels. But actually I wanted to make a point because my uncle actually owns the big timber company in London, and it's a shame that he didn't come here today because I really wanted him to. But his point was actually that he says he tries really hard to sell only certified timber, to try to be sure about the provenance of timber. And he said he's been to loads and loads of seminars and so on over the years, and he finds it really difficult to actually be sure that so there's various different standards floating around. He doesn't have the time or the knowledge because he's not coming from an academic background. He sells timber in the UK, mainly to the construction business because he's pretty big. He says he doesn't know which of the processes or which of the standards are actually worth the paper they're written on. And even then, if they are written on the paper, he doesn't know how much corruption and so on is actually going on behind the scenes. And I mean, I'm probably not saying anything that people wouldn't be aware of, but ultimately I thought his points were quite useful in terms of, focusing attention on actually where the end user is or the end purchaser. And, that's somebody, my uncle genuinely tries to do his best, and he says he's at the point really where he's almost given up.
I think that experience has been reflected across a number of different product lines with considerable confusion. You've only got to go down the supermarket. Any more for the moment? Okay, yeah, Donald.
Donald Curtis. Just a point which applies really both to David's and to Guillermo's presentations. Really coming out of my ignorance, but David is talking in terms of political economy as being the framework within which you have to think about forest governance. And Guillermo's concept of private and versus state or public ownership. What's happened to community in the midst of all this and decentralization? But at one stage in this debate, community management, community ownership, all that sort of stuff was very much debated.
Yes, I had a similar question really. In a sense, even in the Canadian story, the people were very much there at the beginning, but I sort of lost track of them. Yeah. Hugh, did you have a point?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Hugh Beachley, also from Department of International Development. The point that David made was about allocation of forest rights, and he pinpointed that if you don't get that right, you really haven't got, you haven't made a proper start on it. Well, this is really one of the most difficult areas, I think, and probably the last one that you can actually address, because it is so political. So I'd just like to ask whether he thinks that you tackle the easier areas first, where you can start to unpick some of the difficult governance issues, and then you can get onto this one of allocation. I mean, the experience that we've had is, even within the context of VPA work, that allocation of forest rights, at least, and certainly the historical allocation, is an area that you don't go to.
Great, let's pause for a moment. we've got a number of issues on the table. There was a request for guidance on being patient, and related to that, the question about whether in the Costa Rican case, the incentives were beginning to come through in the right way from the policy process. So I suppose John wants to know whether we can still be very patient in Costa Rica. And then secondly, can this kind of blanket approach to trade that the EU is beginning to introduce in fisheries, can it work? What's the experience from the forest sector? Very interesting issue on standards. Are there too many standards already? It seems to be rather confusing for somebody who's clearly specializing in the trade. Where do you go with the proliferation of standards, and how do you distinguish? And then the question about where is community, and what about the decentralized context, which is pretty critical in natural resource management. And lastly, the question about sequencing. Do you do the easy things first? Do you leave the more difficult things for later? David, do you want to go through? We just go in the same order? Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave John's questions that weren't addressed to me. The ones that I can speak about. I think first of all the question from Sandra Walmsley. I think better to speak to John Hudson and Hugh Speechler over there about the VPAs, who they've been very intimately involved on that issue. On the question of too many standards, well, there is the CPET management system, which is handled by DEFRA, which seeks to make it easier for importers to resolve these issues. And as I understand it, it's working reasonably effectively. There are issues there, but I think that is helping the buyers in a very difficult context where there is proliferation of standards. Nobody quite knows how to do it right, and I've heard this quite a lot from buyers saying we are trying to do it right. There's a limit to the amount of investment we can make in trying to do it right, but the risks to us are enormously high, because if we get it wrong, we're going to be blighted for the rest of our careers. So I think there are these systems, and there are several in particular in the Northern European countries. Donald's point about community and decentralization issues. I haven't seen much evidence of these being addressed very effectively at the present time. And the problem is we've got a lot of influence from other policy processes right now, which is making it even more difficult to address these issues, particularly RED. I'm working on Liberia, for example, where there was a massive impetus to have a community rights law. But then the government said, well, just a minute, why should we hand over the family silver to the communities when we're on the cusp of some major inflows of funding to central governments? So, there's that issue to be dealt with. I think that the systems which have been tested far enough, and Bruce would no doubt have his own view on this, and a much more evidence-based one than mine, have found it quite difficult to deal with the community and small operator issues and the large operator issues. And maybe you start with a large and work down the line. Maybe that's the solution. I'm not entirely sure. On Hugh's point, and this issue of forest rights allocation, it very much depends, doesn't it? It depends first of all on the length of concessions, I suppose, because that establishes the length of historical claims, and you don't want to mess around with rights which have been allocated and which are still regarded as valid. One can't interfere with the contractual basis. I was thinking particularly of the Cameroon case, where I think it did work well, and where you had a private sector company which was managing the monitoring of allocation of rights. What slightly dismayed me was that this company was really chased by a lot of the environmental groups which I thought would be supporting it. I suppose it was an alternative provider, a private sector provider, a legal and accountancy firm that was doing the provision. I actually think it did a jolly good job. It did a jolly good job within the provisions of its contract. And clearly a private sector accountancy firm cannot go public in the way that environmental rights groups can go public. and there's a clear constraint upon it. But in that particular case, I thought that the original firm, which is a firm called Olivier Bellet in Guana, did a wonderful job and did not deserve the pillorying it got from many quarters. It decided what the criteria were, it interpreted the criteria, it went through the whole standards exercise on its own, and then it took a very skeptical attitude to any claims. Anybody holding up a bank statement to say that, that they could guarantee financing, it went straight to the bank and said, "This is a valid document," and often they were. So I think that did well, and that was early in the process. But I am in favour of a process approach, and I think if you compare the Cameroon one to some others which haven't worked well, the fact that Cameroon did learn from its experience and gradually improve, I think it's brought its reward. Whether it will continue to do so, I don't know, but I think it has brought its reward up till now. And some quite simple measures. For example, a reading committee which was put in place in Cameroon, which was to separate decisions about information from the validation of information. That comes out of all verification instances. You have to do that. You have to separate the generation and validation of information from decisions about that information. They can't be overlapping. So I think in that particular case, Cameroon actually had 3 different monitors operating at the same time. It worked reasonably well. It was in a propitious situation because they were reallocating concessions at that particular moment. This was not a Malaysian 100-year concession situation. But I think that was a positive experience.
Is that one of your 10 principles, David? Or is that another one?
It's in there, but it's not as a principle as such.
Not quite. It's not. No, it isn't. Interesting. So we've got 11. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I think the possible impact of a better appropriation of these management standards is, we are very hopeful. It's been taken very positively by the state officials and private foresters, and especially we have incorporated in the training processes state officials and private foresters, so they are teaching themselves in this process. The idea is, we believe it's going to go down because we have reduced discretionality. Costa Rica had a problem that has institutionalized the FSC standards. So as you know, principle number 1 was to respect the rights of the workers. So you had to bring together with your management plan a certification of the labor ministry that you were okay with the payments and everything. So we have removed all these from the management standards because we have specific institutions in the country that deals with this type of control on labor and indigenous communities. So we have simplified this situation because this is about legality, not certification. So we had that initial confusion in our system. The other is we have reduced the discretionarity possibility of the state officials. So we have created very concrete forms so the officials can check if the management plan complies or not with what is required. And we have divided inside the government what is administrative and what is control. So the same official doesn't have to do the administrative thing to give the permit and doing the controls when you give the permit to 2 different type of officials, or you submit the papers to 2 different type of officials. So the controlling part will not stop the administrative one. So that is we think it's going to reduce a lot. We also reduce the environmental impact study that used to be done aside from the management plan, because we have included what you needed for the environmental impact inside the management. The idea of a management plan is to prove that you will leave the forest with certain degree of integrity from the ecological point of view, and you will reduce at the maximum the impact of this harvest. So to make an environmental impact is kind of doubling again. So we have reduced that, and of course we simplify all the paperwork. You have to submit the same paperwork for the College of Professional Foresters and then again to the state. So now they communicate themselves, so you submit only one paper, the papers only to one institution. So we are aiming, because this is recently, we have just the second training in December, and we're going to have the third training in March. And a lot of management plans are in the pipeline. So this is a very crucial moment. But we are aiming to decrease the cost of accessing legality from $14 to $6. So this is those are our numbers. In respect to the fisheries and the certification question, I went to the trouble of trying to show you what is my background when thinking about the allocation of resources to political and market institutions. I think the main question here is, within this system, how you share the benefits and costs. Because sometimes one of the problems that are perceived is that the costs are thrown to the forest owners or to the raw material producers. You don't see evidence that the consumer would like to pay more for legal or certified products, or not even the big intermediary companies are willing to accept all of that. So this is kind of a big question about governance. If you're going to implement a system that is going to benefit all, so we have to make sure we share the costs. All the interested actors should bear the cost of implementing such a system. So I don't know if you here in Europe have the chance to choose between legal or certified or not certified wood, and if you would be willing to pay more for it. So I don't know. This is a question to be built from this point. In respect to decentralization and community boards, I claim to be that sometimes I read a lot of articles that says that governance is actually almost as a synonym of democracy. Or we have to look at the governance principles, assuming that you have a democratic system. And of course, a lot of the principles in democracy is participation, decentralization. But I think we have to first know what is the rule of law, political system, and then understand what are the principles that will define the governance in that system. I don't know, maybe if I define principles for governance of democracy and then I apply it to Cuba or to a non-democratic regime like a monarchy, maybe I may get really bad results on my governance evaluation. Even within democratic systems, let's say we are working in Nicaragua, they have very strong policies on decentralization. So actually with Verifor, we have developed a decentralization strategy that includes decentralization, deconcentration, delegation of powers to private auditors and for the regions. So it's a society that requires a lot of decentralization. I think to an extreme point that you feel like you are in a feudal system. So we have to kind of be careful, especially when you don't see in the process of decentralization any type of empowerment for the communities. But it's all a game of power between, let's say, some type of colonial type of structures, municipalities, local governments, but you don't see that they're taking into account local communities. And in respect to sequencing, I think this is part of the thing. We couldn't change a lot of things in these sustainable management standards because we couldn't reach to the agreement, or we were not at the proper level. Like we wanted to reduce the protection area, but it was defined by law. So we were not in the moment to change the law, so we had to respect that. So we could improve in the areas where it was possible to do at the decree level. So this is part of the sequencing that you have to be aware what is the time, the political time for you for changing things when you have to wait for a bigger process to start.
The first question there had something to do with weak governance and margin governance. Just one very quick story to illustrate that. Interviewing the head forester of the Siem Reap province in Cambodia at one point, and asked him what kind of things he actually faced on the ground. And at that point, the Cambodian army had been dispersed throughout the country, really to try to bring it back under some kind of control at the end of the Khmer Rouge regime. And so the major political objective was to try to reknit the country together politically and from public safety point of view and management point of view. So they dispersed the army there, but they did not have the funds in the country to pay the army. So they gave them forest concessions instead. And the generals in charge of the army groups put out those concessions to Malaysian Thai forestry companies. And this forester, who was the public Forest Service manager of the area, was at that point earning $20 US a month. He pointed out that his counterpart working for a Malaysian forest company that was actually conducting the logging, protected by armed military units from being intervened with by government, was earning $350 US a month. It just gives you an idea of what the practical, real-world context is for people trying to make change in the way the forest management happens. In effect, there was a very weak Forest Service in the employ of a government which had much bigger issues to try to deal with. And that if we're going to try to intervene in that case, there's no use plumping for a stronger forest law when you were dealing with a major internal security problem and all the downstream implications of that with a government that had no money. So I think that the whole question of weak governance is a matter of looking carefully at what is actually taking place in the government system, and that it may be working at several moves back from forest law to deal with the issues of whether you have a system that can even absorb and enforce the forest law. So, and I think that applies. It applies worldwide, and it applies in British Columbia as well. We've had major court cases on the board over the question of the relationship amongst the government parts, even though there's lots of checks and balances in a mature democratic system. None of them are perfect. This problem just is on a sliding scale from dismal to a little less dismal. The question of fisheries is an interesting one. In British Columbia, the federal fisheries provides after having presided over the failure of the fish on the East Coast, they moved to the West Coast. They put government monitors on every boat. And so I don't have any statistics of how many of them have fallen overboard, but their effectiveness is certainly got to be a question. If you have an onboard monitor on a bottom dragger, that is completely destroying the benthic environment. And what it seems to raise is the whole question of and this applies to the certification of timber as well, is the whole question of consumption control. We're spending our time at the bottom dragging end and not at the consuming end. And I can go into a supermarket in British Columbia and buy dolphin-friendly tuna fish from 15 different countries. They're all dolphin-friendly. And you can't tell from the label whether it's because they didn't catch any or they exterminated them all already, or they give them a full Anglican burial at sea when they do catch them. You don't really know what that means anymore. And it doesn't seem to affect any price differential on the cans. So the real question is there any drive at the consumption end to actually change the practice of the catching end? And if we're not working at the consumption end, it may not be making any real difference if there's huge amounts of honey to be made. It struck me when I got onto British Airways in Vancouver that the illegal loggers and the bottom draggers were actually getting the first class while I was in steerage. And you need to follow the financial advantage, and that's where I think a lot of the effort has to go, because it's the consuming countries and the consuming populations that are driving the money downhill to the illegal logging or the illegal fishing sources. The sourcing of legal timber and certified timber that you talked about, there is no evidence for any price advantage at this point of certified products, even with really meticulously handled legal timber with extremely tight provenance and
source control that may not provide one iota of price advantage in the marketplace unless the consumers are prepared to pay more, which mostly they aren't, and particularly now. But one thing we have noticed is that there is an access advantage starting to appear, and even companies in British Columbia which have gotten away with the lowest level of certification in the past are now flirting with FSC, because in a downturn that may be the one access advantage that allows them into a marketplace that is left intact. So that's something to watch, is access advantage over price advantage. And even though we may not be able to sort it out now, it may become really more important in the future. The last point was communities. And there's two movements going on right now in North America. I don't know how widespread they are elsewhere. It sounded to me like they were also happening in Britain, which is called the relocalization movement. The resumption of community control over agriculture, forestry, environmental conditions, commerce at the small town level. And that there's also a movement in, again, worldwide, but rampaging in California, called the transition towns, which is also a movement to reassert the authority of small villages and towns for their local environment. And in British Columbia right now, we have an election looming, and there's a major debate going on over the size of allocations to community forests, largely on the grounds that the forest industry should be creating goods and services at a community level, not just at a gross revenue government level. So it seems to me that those movements, I think, are just indicative of the realization that large-scale industrial activity on a globalized basis is the killer of communities, and that needs to be, that balance wheel needs to shift back. I think that's an extremely important movement, and it's probably something, again, it's like looking at the question of weak governance. Weak governance on the one hand, weak association with the people who would actually be stewards of the real place. Both need to be redressed, and those may be more important to work on community development than it would be on forest law, in order to have somebody who could actually absorb the duties of the forest law.
Great, well thank you very much. We're actually out of time, but that's been a really nice discussion. I think we've launched